posted a quote on Instagram, kind of referencing Galatians chapter 1, 16 and 17. And when he posted it, it caused me to want to kind of go look into it this morning as it was speaking to me. And so I just want to share with you this morning some thoughts, man, that God has just kind of spoken to me this morning through Galatians chapter 1, 16 and 17. And pretty much what it says is, we'll start at verse 15. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him amongst the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. And it's interesting because previously I kind of always looked at those verses as, you know, Paul gets the call. We see in Acts chapter 9, we see that God says this, and he must know what it means to suffer for my name's sake, and I will send him amongst the Gentiles. And so we see his call into ministry. We see his assignment placed on him at that time. And so then when we get into Galatians, we learn that Paul went away. And so I've always looked at that as this was a time where Paul went away to be with the Lord, to get revelation of the mission, and to do some, and to be preached to by Christ. That was a previous thought of mine from a few years ago. And so, but upon some studying this morning, God kind of revealed that that's not exactly what happened. And so what's interesting is two trains of thoughts that God kind of spoke to me this morning. I just want to share that with you. First, Paul says, when I was given the mission, I did not immediately consult with flesh, is how the ESV renders it. However, older translations like the King James Version will render it as, I did not consult with flesh and blood. So I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. And so two things to look at, like, from that. It's saying that when God had spoken directly to Paul, that directly to you, giving you your vision, giving you your mission, giving you your assignment, you do not go seek the approval of man before being obedient to God. And now I'm not saying that you do not consult counsel. The Bible lets us know that a wise man consults many counsel. And so I'm not saying that we don't consult counsel. But what the word is saying is that when God has spoken to you clearly, and it's not that you're trying to understand what God is saying, but when you know, you got to remember the vision and the revelation that was given to Paul on Damascus Road was nothing that can be confused as who was speaking. And so this was very clear to Paul what he was supposed to do. And so because it was very clear to him what he was supposed to do, he did not need to go and consult men for the assignment. Now here's why. I think that's very interesting. Sometimes men don't understand your assignment. And in not understanding your assignment from a place of ignorance, they can discourage you from doing what God told you to do. Because you got to understand, Paul was uniquely called to go preach the gospel message to the Gentiles. And at that time, Paul began to understand the mystery that was the church, that there would be an inclusiveness of the Gentile nations amongst the Jews, that God was making one new humanity for himself, tearing down that wall of hostility that existed between the Jews and the Gentiles, and making for himself a third race, that is the body of Christ. And so he understood that. But the Jews did not always understand that. And we know that the apostles didn't always get that either. We see that from from Peter's dealing with Cornelius. We see that right in Galatians chapter 2 when he meets hostility when he goes up to Jerusalem. And so we understand that they didn't get that. And that God had revealed that to Paul in the way that it was certain and sure. And so had he had consulted with the apostles that came before him, had he had consulted with other Jewish people, they may have discouraged him and saying, why are you going to the Gentiles with this message? Because they did not yet understand it. And so Paul could not consult man. And sometimes in our life, when God has given us such a vision, such an assignment that is so radical to the norm, that is so countercultural, that is so counter-church, Western church, if we give that vision away too soon, we can be discouraged because men can begin to speak and good intentions out of ignorance, and therefore discourage you. And so that's the first thing that God kind of told me this morning is when the vision is clear, don't seek confirmation from men who may not understand the call, but simply seek obedience to Jesus by doing what God has called you to do. Paul then later, of course, we know, went to Jerusalem and consulted with the apostles, but it was not for confirmation. It was not for confirmation of his assignment. The second thing is in Matthew 16 and 17, right when we see Peter make this revelatory statement about who Jesus is, the Messiah, the Son of God, you see Jesus say to him, listen, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but it was revealed to you by my Father who was in heaven. And so I was wrestling with the thoughts that when Paul says I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, and I'm referencing that with Matthew 16 and 17, understanding that some things can't be revealed by flesh and blood, but only by the Father who is in heaven. God kind of also began to speak to allow me to understand that, listen, sometimes the assignment cannot be aided by the wisdom of man. Sometimes the vision can only be aided by the revelation of Jesus Christ, can only be revealed by the Father who is in heaven, because the assignment sometimes is so big that men have no wisdom to help you with that. And so it's not, again, that we don't consult with men, we don't consult with wise counsel. It's that we should be on our knees more than we should be in the office of our pastor, more than we should be in the counsel of our friends. We should be on our knees seeking the counsel of God for the next steps, for the aid, for the rest of the vision, for the rest of the puzzle, for the rest of the sketch, more than we should be consulting with men. Again, I'm not saying we do not seek wise counsel. That would be a foolish thing for me to say. I am simply saying that we should spend more time consulting with God than we should be consulting with men, because sometimes the wisdom of men cannot aid the vision, because they do not have the revelation or the wisdom of God to help you along the way. Flesh and blood, Peter, did not reveal this thing to you. Flesh and blood was saying that Jesus was not the Son of God. Flesh and blood was saying, is this not just the carpenter, but the Father who is in heaven revealed to Peter who it was that Christ was. And sometimes only God can aid the vision. That was the second thing that God kind of spoke to me through from Galatians, and I hope that blesses you. But here's the third thing, and I write things down in my journal, man, because I'm journaling what God is speaking to me. I'm journaling this vision so I can always go back and reference. But here's the other thing. God gave Paul the vision to go to the Gentiles. And previously when he says, and so I didn't go immediately to Jerusalem, but I went to Arabia, I always looked at it as this desert island. He went to this desert place to be in solitude with Jesus. And sometimes we got to go away for a long time and just be poured in from Jesus before we can start our ministry. And how foolish of me to think that way, because the text says in Acts chapter 9 that immediately Paul went to Damascus and began to preach Jesus. But here's the thing, man. When amongst some more studying, what God showed me and revealed to me was that Arabia was a heavy Gentile, well-populated Gentile place. And so what Paul is saying is that immediately when Jesus told me that my mission was to go and preach the gospel to the Gentiles, before I went to Jerusalem, immediately I went to Arabia. Immediately I went to work. I went to a place that was well populated with Gentiles, and I went to work carrying out the vision and the mission and the assignment that God had given me. And that was interesting. And the reason I was interested is because later on we get into Acts chapter 13, and we see that they had been called up to Antioch. Him and Barnabas were called up to Antioch, and then they were commissioned, right, to go out into his missionary journeys. And then we see the missionary journey, his first missionary journey trip begin right into the regions of and so, but here's the thing. In accordance with Acts chapter 9 to when we get to Acts chapter 13, that would mean that Paul was already working his assignment far before the men in Antioch called him up and blessed him or commissioned him to go out and plant churches. And so what that means is that Paul was not called up simply because they thought this was a good guy to do the job. But it was that they called him up because they recognized that the work and the assignment that they had now been called to do, there was a man who was already doing it on assignment by God, and he was already doing it. And so what that said to me, going back to the consulting of man, is that sometimes men won't understand the assignment if you go to them first. Rather, if you begin to just be obedient to God and do what he called you to do, the fruit of your work begins to show proof of the call that God has on your life. And now men who did not understand the call now begin to understand the call, and now they begin to lay hands and commission that work. And sometimes you got to just show and tell. You can't just tell, you got to show and tell. And so that was some of the things that God just kind of spoke to me this morning. And so I'm thinking that the three things to leave you with is this, man. Whatever God is calling you to do, whatever the assignment is that God has on your life, I'm not saying do not seek wise counsel. What I'm saying is, when it is as clear as the call on Damascus Road was to Saul, when it is as clear that you are supposed to be doing this, you do not need the approval of man to begin to do it. Man may not even understand your call. Man may not even understand your assignment, because it was revealed to you by the Father. And it is something, the mystery of the gospel is something that was bigger, that the Bible says the prophets didn't even understand the mystery of the gospel. They didn't even understand this inclusiveness of the Gentiles, even though it's spread all throughout the Old Testament. That it is a small thing, that Isaiah said, to think that he is only coming to the Jews, but that he is the Messiah of the nations. And so you gotta just do it. You gotta just be obedient, and being obedient to the call, you begin to show God's hand upon your life, and you begin to affirm and confirm to others that you're actually doing the very thing that God called you to do, because the hand of the Lord is on you. So listen, man, be blessed. Read that for yourself. Study it for yourself. And let me know how this may have blessed you. Hey, thank you. Take care.